Josiah Everett writes of himself in this poem. Born of men undaunted, dreams of greatness unhindered, he breathes air, he bleeds red. He strides like a pigeon and eats like a caveman, a man among the myriad, hungry amongst the full. His name is Josiah Everett. He is a child of God, much like yourself, perhaps. J.K. Rowling writes of him in this excerpt of mediocre prose. If the motorcycle was huge, it was nothing compared to Josiah, who sat astride it. He was twice as tall as a normal man and at least 5 times as wide. He looked simply too big to be allowed, and so wild. Long tangles of bushy black hair and beard hid most of his face. He had hands the size of trash can lids, and his feet in their leather boots were like baby dolphins. Nicholas Sparks once rode on an airplane with Josiah. Nicholas Sparks wrote of their airbound interaction in the third person, and he worked it into his book, The Notebook. And I quote, "They didn't agree on much. In fact, they didn't agree on anything. They fought all the time and challenged each other every day. But despite their differences, they had one important thing in common. They both hoped Nicholas Sparks would never write another novel again." C.S. Lewis writes of Josiah, "It may be hard for an egg to turn into a bird. It would be a jolly sight harder for it to learn to fly while remaining an egg. If the moon was a person, and that person was the sun, that was also a piece of sports equipment, and that equipment was a surgically precise Gatling gun and a dragon, then that person would be Josiah Everett. Or Tom Brady. He can't be both, you choose. Josiah Everett."
Oh, thank you, everyone. For tonight, I wrote a humorous piece. It's inspired by true events that I heard secondhand from a friend of a friend. So, it's called God Have Mercy. For Brian Mathis, for whom none of these events depicted on these pages would have been possible nor existent. It was the one for the books. Every Saturday morning, our church's music team had practice at 9 a.m. sharp. Jim, the head music leader, hated people to be late. He was the kind of guy who poured over compliments to make sure there wasn't a way for it to be interpreted as some kind of criticism. And if you did offer him any of the latter, constructive or otherwise, you went on his mental list. Better watch out. You get your names on that list enough times, and you became the victim of dragon fire passive aggression. There's that old story about how after the fall of the Soviet Union, a meeting was held and someone asked Gorbachev why he or any of his cronies never tried to say anything in regard to the atrocities committed by the state. Allegedly, Gorbachev rose and screamed out into the audience, "Who said that? Who said that?" The tension could have broken links of chain. After a moment of silence, he composed himself and continued, "That's how. Ask Jim why he did a song a certain way and you'd get a similar reply, but about 10,000 times more passive-aggressive, ruling with an iron fist. When my dad used to approach him about his concerns with certain song lyrics and their theological value, Jim would send long email replies about the way artists think. And Stephanie Meyer must be Ernest Hemingway. Despite his flaws, everyone always said, as they say about anyone, they have no clear perception. He has a good heart. That kind of statement really made you stop and think. I mean, the man drank his body weight in Mountain Dew every single day of his life. To make matters better, he always drank it out of a red Solo cup. You know how some people believe in different types of intelligence? Well, apparently you can test over 160 in the unthinkable category. There aren't a lot of people in their right mind who would walk around a church with a red cup like him, but he went beyond walking around and carried that thing like a gun. He was a natural. I've been planning on getting him a custom holster for it for a long time. He'd tote that thing around at his side like a peacemaker. There's always room for another portly church cowboy. The Saturday morning in question started business as usual. Don't ask me why, but for every music practice, Earl Fisher, our head elder for who knows how long, would strut his stout frame to the parsonage front door in his cowboy boots. He suffered from a little bit of small man's disease, and the boots were just the tip of the iceberg. I suppose they did make him taller. If you ever open my book, you'll see his name written down with a 1 in the box next to it, and boot utilizer would be scrawled in the comment section. The reason he came to our house on Saturday morning was to get the key to the church. He would unlock the main door and let the music team in for practice. When everybody was accounted for, Earl left the church, handed my dad the key, and drove home, returning in 2 hours to lock the church back up. The oldest person in our church was Ethel Berman, clocking in at 102. Once, I tried to ask her why we did it that way, and her only reply was, "Of course we do." I went home and made a pros and cons list regarding Earl's process, and the pro side just about managed to slip into the negatives. The very last con I jotted down was, "Wears out Earl's boots faster." I had to tell him. After Earl left, my younger brother Tyler, who was 15, got up from the table and walked over to the church. Our church had recently gotten a new sound system, and he was considered his aficionado. He had trained one other guy, Fred Danforth, the basics of it, but it would be another few months or years until he figured out the power switch. Before Tyler left, my older brother Matt asked him why he was going late. To see Jim's face. Matt and I laughed and told him to wait for a second. Matt said, "Ty, want in on a little prank?" "I guess." I said, "Here's the lowdown. See this CD? Jim's singing for offertory tomorrow, and we think you should use it instead of the accompaniment CD." Tyler's face lit up like a volcano, and he grabbed it from me before tearing out the door. Matt and I looked at each other. We didn't really know to be delighted or terrified, though, because A, Tyler was the youngest, and B, as usual, our mom would undoubtedly find out. But the loop it would throw the church. Needless to say, we spent the rest of the day telling ourselves that we were doing the right thing. When Tyler got to the church late, he said Jim gave him a look, and he just smiled and waved right back. Moments like this made Jim desperate to learn how to use the sound system. We often conjectured that he would stay up all night sometimes, poring over his diabolical plan to not only sing up front, but control the sound at the same time. That's how Jim would have saved the world if he managed to defy mortality. Practice was slow as usual, Jim tweaking the untweakable, a troll in the eyes of everybody present. After Jim dismissed the musicians, he waddled to the back of the church and handed Tyler his accompaniment CD. Tyler said that during the whole practice, he pictured the 1,001 ways Jim would contort his face when the culmination of everything wrong with the 90s would come blaring over the speakers the next day. Tyler complimented Jim after each of the 6 run-throughs. They finished up just as Earl clicked through the entrance, keys jingling in his hands. Tyler came home and walked into the living room. Our mom was cleaning upstairs, so naturally Matt asked him about the CD in a low voice. Tyler told us about his success. Does Jim have any idea? Are you kidding? He was too turned on by his own voice. My mom called down the stairs. What are you guys whispering about? Tyler replied, "Mom, we're fine!" He scrubbed the bathroom floor with a toothbrush for the rest of the afternoon. That morning, the 3 of us sat in Sunday school throwing glances in each other's direction. We all sighed when Mary Beth Wilson started asking a question. The only thing about her that was well preserved was her adolescent voice. Every time she let out a syllable, she sighed, agonizing over every word she said. The real killer, though, was that by the time she had soliloquied, nobody could quite put their finger on where she was coming from. This particular day, Bill Milton was teaching about dissension among the brethren. She raised her hand and started her soliloquy as usual. Well, I don't know where, well, it's just, maybe your church just, well, it's so wonderful, but I mean, what do Christians argue about? I mean, well, I don't understand. Is it something to do with the stores being open on Sundays and, well, women working, and I just don't know. Say what you will, but this example is master craftsmanship compared to the other doozies she would bring up every other week. Every conceivable issue in the world was packed into an ideas casserole. Too many potlucks. All she saw was in terms of casserole. I'd go so far as to say that the world was her casserole. One might say oyster, but she had never seen one. There was a half hour between Sunday schools and in the beginning of church, a chance for Jim to get one last practice in with the music team. I sat with Tyler in the booth. 15 minutes in, Jim stopped everything and asked Tyler to turn up Beatrice McElhaney's microphone. Tyler gave him a thumbs up and turned the knob 2 notches to the left. I furrowed my brow at him, but he shrugged and commented that she was the last person who ever needed a mic turn up. You see, our sound system broadcast on the radio within a few blocks of the church, and listening to the singers attempting to harmonize was like hearing a barbershop quartet, visually as well as audibly. I leaned over to Tyler. We still doing this? We? That's good to know. Are we? I'm all about it. Good. What do you think Mom's gonna do? Don't even think about it. But, to be quite honest, that's all any of us thought about whenever we pulled stunts like this. Every time we did something mischievous, the punishment always fit the crime, but each punishment was a smaller explosion on its way to the big kahuna. A fuse can't last forever. The service started and my dad said the opening prayer, ending with, "Thank you, Father, for being our aid in times of temptation." He may as well have said, "We offer up a prayer for the souls of Tyler and Bradley." My palms were sweating, and whenever someone turned their head at all, I assumed they were looking to see where the heartbeat was coming from. That's how it always was. Any rabble-rousing we ever did made me shrivel up and my backside sweat so badly, a ShamWow wasn't even a plausible solution. Finally, it was time for the offering. The ushers marched forward, Earl leading the way, cowboy elder of the highest order. My dad held out the offering plates and said a prayer over them, then handed them to the ushers. Jim stood up and held his microphone like a cup of tea in front of his massive punch and wore a look that said, "You will love this as much as I do." As the ushers turned with the plates, I said an extra prayer over the money because the words they were about to hear would taint it. They were in earshot of utter smut. But the CD began playing, and it was regular old accompaniment. I honestly breathed a sigh of relief. Jim began singing. I looked at Tyler, who shrugged, which I reciprocated. But just as he felt the build up to the chorus, the music started to crescendo, and Marshall Mathers broke into his 2000 song of identity revelation, The Real Slim Shady. All that Earl knew was that it was rap music, and he was on the case. He darted his gaze towards Jim, then Tyler, and so on, until he lunged towards the back of the church. He tripped over his own feet and landed sprawled out on his face. He tried to get to his feet, but he kept falling. It got to the point where he was staggering towards the sound booth. The eyes of the world were upon him. I caught a glimpse of his eyes. God have mercy. Marlon Brando could have spent 50 years in front of a mirror and nothing he came up with his face would have been even close. Tyler turned to the CD player and feigned pressing the off button. As Earl made his way along the ground, he managed to utter, "Turn it off! It's stuck! Unstuck it! I'm trying!" Bill Milton started closing the window so that no passerby would hear. He got the 2 on the port side and jogged over to starboard, but on the way he tripped over Earl and landed in the laps of Ann and Dorothy, 2 big old cat lady sisters who had lived with each other since at least Pearl Harbor. They started making screeching noises and hitting Bill as they tried to push him off. To be honest, their movements were even more cat-like than their own felines. Bill managed to hoist himself up using the back of a pew and Dorothy's knee as support. Dorothy just about had a conniption, throwing her hand over her mouth and looking to Anne for solace, to undo the wrong that had just been done to her. Mary Beth was sitting near the front, eyes wide open. My guess is that until that day, she didn't actually believe that some of those words in Mather's vocabulary actually existed. This whole affair would undoubtedly go down as one of her war stories. Mr. Mathers broke into the second verse. "Will Smith don't got a cuss in his rap to sell records? Well, I do." I raked the sanctuary with my eyes and saw that nobody seemed to quite know what to do. Some of the older folks stared forward or shook their heads, lamenting our lost generation. Some parents covered their children's ears or turned around to see if anybody was trying to put a stop to it. Others left the room. My dad and the rest of the elders and deacons were soon gathered around the sound booth, watching as Tyler kept trying to get the button to work. Earl was the last one to arrive, but was still undeterred. He clicked and tripped over the wall, one of his boots sliding off his leg. He limped now and ripped the fire extinguisher off the wall, proceeding to spray the device, flinging the hose wildly with his hands until all of us were covered with the stuff. Satisfied that the extinguisher wasn't a feasible solution via the hose, Earl picked it up with both hands and brought it down on the CD player 3 times in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The music stopped after the first hit and all eyes stared at Earl, flinching at the ensuing thud cracks. Silence. Earl gazed at his handiwork, backing up as he set the extinguisher on the ground. Cowboy indeed. A discussion followed about who the culprit might have been. Earl and Bill Milton grilled Jim for a few minutes about where he'd gotten the CD, why he had played it, etc., until Jim was on the verge of crying. And seeing a grown man like him about to do that made me want to cry. I looked at Tyler, who I could tell was moving mountains in order to keep a straight face. When people hear the phrase, good idea at the time, they usually have a very specific incident where they either learned it or the idea became completely real to them. The latter certainly happened for me that day. As people made their way back to their seats, I saw my mom sitting in the front pew. The look in her eyes made Earl's 10 minutes earlier look like a sleepy puppy. The 1,000-yard glare. It was everything to keep my waist faculties functional. The fuse was gone. After church, high noon, Yellowstone was going to erupt. Pompeii would be a mere child. After church, Tyler, Matt, and I sat in the kitchen and heard the door open. My mom's shoes clicked through the hall, coming closer. A small part of me wondered if just maybe being a passenger on the Hindenburg wouldn't have been so bad. Thank you.